Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class. This time, or for this unit, we are going to move away from the medieval period. We're all done with them. We're all done with Dante and all the knights and King Arthur and all that kind of stuff. And now we're moving into the Renaissance period. Now, for this particular unit, we're not going to really spend as much time as we have on other historical periods. I think we'll probably only have about 2 videos for this one. The Renaissance, for our Renaissance unit, what we're essentially going to do is just have a couple little general historical notes, very similar to what we did with the ancient Rome unit. And then we're going to take probably just one video or one lesson where we're going to take a look at the writings and the style and the uniqueness of William Shakespeare, and then do the exact same thing for John Milton. So stay tuned for that, because those are, very, very beautiful authors and very, very wonderful works that they've created. However, for our class today, what we're going to look at is this version of the notes that I usually have my students follow along with. We're going to talk about the general historical features of the Renaissance era, and then we're going to the Renaissance period, I should say. And we're going to talk about Protestantism for a little bit, this new wave or this new movement in culture and in religion. We're going to talk a little bit about the English monarchy, just briefly, and then we're going to talk about humanism and art and science, okay? And then we'll end with literature. We won't do literature today. We're going to move on and do literature for a separate video, so we can talk about Shakespeare and Milton separately, okay? So follow along. Most of these are pretty straightforward. It's just fill in the blank, kind of discussion and side notes sort of a thing. Nothing really too difficult. So the Renaissance. What is this exactly? The Renaissance, the rebirth, right? The reemergence of what and when? Well, the Renaissance period was basically the period that followed, you would call it the late medieval era. So I think it was the 1300s, we had the Renaissance begin to emerge at the very kind of closing of the medieval era. Now, what this essentially means is that you can kind of conflate the two, generally speaking. You don't always have to have them be completely the same, completely, two totally different separate periods, but they're generally seen as very, very closely knit in their culture. So all of the things that we saw kind of coming from the medieval period in terms of its culture still translates pretty easily over to the Renaissance, with some exceptions, as we're going to see. Now, the time period, 1300 AD to about 1600 AD, and it's followed by the Enlightenment. Now, first, before we start that, the thing you'll notice is that that Dante-ish period, when we were looking at the Divine Comedy, we were looking at Dante, that essentially does close off the medieval period and then begin moving us into the Renaissance. Now, the Enlightenment I put up here because, as we're going to see once we move into the Enlightenment, that the sequence of history, in terms of it being seen as chapters in this kind of progressive story, becomes a little bit more easy to characterize, if you want. It becomes a little bit more clear. And this is one of the reasons I love, teaching history in the sequence of essentially like a chapter book, because that is how we will really get a kind of a clearer understanding. Even if it starts out being a little bit simplistic, it starts to kind of at least formulate the organization of history in our mind very well. So the first thing we need to note about the Renaissance is the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so in terms of the actual deep roots of the culture, and its kind of religious and ideological foundations, we have a reform happen within the Christian religion, which at that time was essentially Roman Catholic. That was the dominant religion of Europe. It then shifted away from Roman Catholicism and moved, and not shifted away, but it broke off into all of these different Protestant forms and these different Protestant movements, in contrast to the Roman Catholic tradition. Now, what that means, what that looks like, we'll get to that in a minute, but just know that at the kind of core of the cultural movement and the cultural soil was this division between the Christians in some way, shape, or form. The emergence of the natural sciences, again, was a major movement in this particular period as well. And I say emergence because we saw the roots and the kind of beginnings of it and the development of it in the medieval period. We saw the institutions that would become the sciences and become the foundations and the hubs of education really taking form in the medieval period, and the philosophy that will drive them forward definitely was emerging in the medieval period. But to be to form into something more familiar to what we would recognize as natural science today. That was much more present during the Renaissance. We have also the beginning of secularism, not a development really, but just kind of the beginning roots and the seeds of what we would call secularism, which again, we'll talk about in a little while, but it's going to be really important once we shift into the Enlightenment period. The major rise in English literature. Yeah, so we have the final thing here, the final development of artwork that I'm going to focus on is the emergence of English literature as we would probably know it today. The literature that we've looked at since the Roman unit has essentially been ancient literature, then moving into kind of early Anglo-Saxon literature, and then essentially Middle English literature. So if you remember back to our Beowulf unit, we had this discussion about what English, Old English really is, what it really looks like. Well, during this particular period, we are writing in what's called early modern English. So the kind of the last little form of the English language that emerges right before we get into what you and I will recognize as kind of contemporary modern English that we would understand totally fluently. Okay, and that, of course, as you see, it takes the forms of plays, poetry, and even novels eventually. Okay, so first and foremost, Protestantism. What is this? Je me protestant, someone who protests, right? The term protest is in it. Well, what are we protesting? What is this movement? What is this ism all about? A Protestant, as it says here, is one who protests against the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, i.e. the Pope. Most popular, or it was very popular, I should say, and it really begins in Germany, as well as France and England. Okay, those were the kind of the three big hubs of Protestantism in the beginning of the movement. It really begins with Martin Luther. He is truly the first Protestant reformer, okay? Now, notice the terminology there. Martin Luther is a controversial figure for a lot of different reasons. His views on religion notwithstanding, he also, there's a lot of different reasons why he's controversial, but generally you're going to have two different perspectives on him, depending on what side of the kind of Christian aisle you fall on. On one side, we have him essentially painted as someone who looks at the state of the Catholic Church as it is in this particular period of time and does not like it and thinks that there are problems and we need to reform it and then kind of like, get it back on track. Others look at him and see him as the one who basically was rejecting the Catholic Church and saying that almost everything you guys are doing is wrong. Your reforms are so numerous and so necessary that we just need to do them, get rid of them, and then basically we need to open the path to a Protestant, a more Protestant way of looking at things. Now, basically, the key things you need to know about Martin Luther are just this. He is the first Protestant reformer. He's the first one to really oppose the authority of the Pope, the authority of Rome, the authority of the Catholic Church and the clergy. And he proposes his famous 95 theses that he nails to the door of the church in this now famous scene that he does, and starts this whole kind of almost revolution of a reformation of the church. Okay, now we're not going to go through like specifically what it was that Martin Luther didn't like. However, one thing I want to discuss in a little while is that Martin Luther, or Lutheranism, it is not to be equated with what we usually think of as Protestantism today. Protestantism, like in America especially, Protestantism, ladies and gentlemen, is a simple kind of blanket umbrella term for any Christian who is not Roman Catholic and is not Eastern Orthodox. Okay, so the Protestants, if you want, there's basically like these two branches of Christianity. There's the Eastern Orthodox going over here, in the East and upwards into Russia. And then there's the Roman Catholic Church, which was the dominant one in Europe, right? That was like as we talked about in the medieval unit, that was the soil of the cultural religion at the time. And then what you have on that side, on that Roman Catholic side, is then another branch where we have the Protestants break off. But that branch quickly kind of divides into all different forms of Protestantism. So if someone says, I'm a Protestant, that just means that you're within that bubble, you're within that branch. But all these other different forms of Christianity, whether it's Calvinism, Lutheranism, Latter-day Saints, all this kind of stuff, those all technically mostly fall under the Protestant branch. There's exceptions like the Jehovah Witnesses and the Mormons technically are all, and the Unitarians as well, are technically a separate group. We'll talk about them in a minute, but welcome to the complexities of Christian denominations. So following Martin Luther, we have this gentleman, John Calvin, over in France. He is a reformer who emphasized the sovereignty of God over human free will. We mentioned Calvin because he is one of the other big, like, primary movers of the Protestant movement, essentially. And he still to this day has a very strong following in his version of, of, of belief, of his practice of Christianity, his understanding of Christianity. What really characterizes him, as it says here, is his hyper focus on the sovereignty of God over human free will. Okay, so as in terms of our discussion of denominations in a little while, just know that that's kind of what makes Calvin a little bit more noteworthy. Now, why do I say that? Why do we actually pause to look at Calvin's beliefs? It's because he breaks the mold actually a little bit with both the Roman Catholics, other Protestants, and other Eastern Orthodox. If you remember back to our discussion of Christianity, they generally do value human free will quite severely. If you could, I didn't articulate that entirely, but Christianity as a religious tradition has a very strong, what do you want to call it? Strong theme of emphasizing human free will and human choice in choosing to follow God, choosing not to. Calvin sort of breaks the mold when he really chooses to emphasize, again, not entirely being completely inconsistent with the claims of Christianity, but he basically says that I want to focus more on this sovereignty of God, and that's kind of the emphasis that we're going to take. So much to the point where human free will actually gets subordinated and overshadowed to a degree in his particular understanding of religion. Okay, so he's a little bit of an odd duck in that sense. A lot of Christians, like today, if you talk to Christians in Protestant circles and especially Roman Catholic circles, feel very strongly about John Calvin, one way or the other. Some people think he's a total heretic. Some people think that he's completely wrong. He's denying God's love and all this kind of stuff. Some people think, no, he's being very biblically accurate. He's being consistent. Everyone else needs to just figure it out. All right, so fun controversy. Speaking of controversy, we introduce King Henry VIII of the English monarchy. Okay. Why do we need to talk about this guy? Well, because King Henry VIII, famous figure, go watch the series, The Tudors. You get a nice Hollywood version of him there. But he was, as you can see, the King of Britain who rejected the Pope's authority after an argument over his divorce. Why he needed to divorce his first wife, all these other wives following, long, complicated, dramatic, political, geopolitical, and romantic reasons. It doesn't really matter all that much for us. But what does matter for this discussion is that in his denial of the Catholic authorities in his country and over his country, he creates the religion of Anglicanism, okay? Which, as you're going to see, caused a lot of problems with the Catholics in England. But you eventually get the creation of the Anglican Church, which is a religious system which is a version of Christianity, where it is the King of England, is the monarch of England, rather, who is the head of the church, not the Pope in Rome, okay? Now, that should make me give you a few flashbacks to what we talked about in the medieval era when we discussed feudalism and the authority within feudalism. We said that at the top, technically, of the feudal system is the monarch. However, in my little question for each of those roles in a feudal system, I asked you, who does this particular figure at each level owe authority to? So we know that the peasants owe their authority, or owe their allegiance rather, to the knights. The knights owe theirs to the lords above them, the kind of the nobility above them, and the nobles owe their allegiance to the king. But who does the king owe allegiance to? Welcome to that debate. King Henry is essentially, and Anglicanism is a result, if you want, of that debate, where some people wanted to say a monarchy is essentially answerable to the head of the Catholic religion, which is the Pope. Because the Pope is closer to God, the Pope has more of a relationship, kind of a closeness to the divine and the understanding of religion. And so we as monarchs should kind of, follow his lead. But you can see why some monarchs don't like that, because as happens, in a more functional way, in a more dysfunctional way, the Pope then essentially becomes a monarch of monarchs. He is the one who kind of has power over all monarchs in Europe, this causes conflict. It causes conflict with King Henry to the extent where he finally says, okay, I am no longer going to follow you. I am no longer going to be subject to Rome. I am my own monarch. I rule my country as I see fit, and as I try to follow God as I see fit. And he does draw his inspiration from that, not just from his own marital, romantic and political frustrations at home, but he also sees in his own country the beginnings of Protestantism. He begins to have these figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, circulating in his, at least in his understanding or in his mind, where he says, wait a minute, we have new theological developments that are arguing that say, hey, you can still follow God and be very close to God without having to follow Rome. That's essentially Protestantism to its core. And King Henry sees this and he says, yeah, fine, okay, I am now the head of the Church of England. Okay, now that is going to make a huge problem for England and England's culture back then and all the way up until probably about 100 years ago, where the problem is essentially, well, okay, now what do the citizens do? Because the citizens were all Catholic, as of 2 minutes ago. So they're all devout Catholics. So you now have to be, as a monarch, say, no, you need to stop following the Pope. You need to follow me. How's that going to go over? How is that going to go? That causes a huge cultural division that does lead to war at times in England. So much so that, again, even until about 100 years ago, to be a Catholic in England was essentially to be the victim, was going to result in being the victim of a lot of discrimination or a lot of prejudice. People really did not like Catholics in Britain as of about 100 years ago, if not less. So that happens, right? This happens in Europe. It's a big deal. Now, following this, we have Queen Elizabeth, his daughter. So Queen Elizabeth I, right, the famous Virgin Queen of England, is King Henry's daughter. And she is famous for, number one, repelling the Spanish invasion of England, which would have conquered England, which would have been a major defeat of this country that eventually becomes a dominant power in the world. She repels it. She saves England in that regard. And again, fighting, showing that kind of conflict in some sense, between the Protestants and the Catholics, because I think it's not Philip of France, it's I forget his name, the Spanish king is a Catholic, and like we talked about in the religion unit, uses that whole conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism as a factor within his reason to conquer England. There's other reasons why, but he of course is going to use that one too. And she ushers in the Elizabethan era, which is when we see the height of a lot of Renaissance developments, particularly in literature with William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare's around at that time as well. So that's Queen Elizabeth, notorious also for not liking Catholics and kind of going after Catholics. She is not a fan of the papists. So welcome to the conflicts that Protestantism has wrought at that time. Now, at the same time, we have the development of a philosophy or an ideological movement called humanism. What is humanism all about? Well, as the name implies, it is a focus. It is a philosophy and a sequence of thought that focuses heavily on human free will and the abilities, as it says here, of human reason, power, and also human history. Now, let's think about that for a minute. How is this different than a lot of what we had seen before in terms of ideology? Humanism, the exaltation of the human being, the power of the human being. Well, the easy example is to contrast it with the other dominant philosophy and ideology of the time, which is Catholicism. Okay, Catholicism is not fundamentally a humanistic belief system, I think. If I'm going to be bold, I'm going to say that it's fundamentally not. Because while Christianity and by extension Catholicism do exalt the human being, as we saw in religion and in Christianity, they say, yes, human beings are the apex of creations. They are the stewards of the earth. They are meant to be the stewards of the earth. They have the image of God in them. They have, the most capacity, all this kind of stuff. And yet they also are corrupted and fallen, and they are compromised. And they also, to kind of extend the ideas of Christianity a little bit more, they need to be humble and virtuous in the face of God and the divine and their own corruptedness. So they need to not grasp onto their own, self-focus and pride. Humanism tries to, in some sense, balk against that a little bit. It says no, that we should acknowledge that the accomplishments of man, of humans, are amazing and great and should be celebrated and even pushed and kind of cultivated more. And so you can kind of see where this is going to go. You can see why this happens also, by the way, because as more and more science develops, as more architecture and innovation kind of begins to develop at this time, the focus of our art, of our ideas, of our interests shift away from, if you want, the traditional more Catholic Christian ideas like salvation, God, the transcendent, and they begin to shift a little bit more towards the greatness of human beings. Now that's a pretty simplistic and harsh way that I'm putting that, but that's essentially how it was viewed at the time, and it was also kind of it's a very kind of simplified version of the conflict. Now, I put the word secular in here because it's good to know just for where humanism, I think you could argue, eventually leads in history. Secular is a term for something that is non-religious. Secularum is like worldly, right? It is like focusing on the world, not focusing on the religious, not the transcendent, all that kind of stuff. So what you have eventually afterwards, I think not necessarily in the Renaissance, but definitely in the Enlightenment, is the emergence of what we would call secular humanism, which is an ideological movement of people and culture that does not want to focus on religion, does not want to focus on the tenets of religion, on what religion has given or what it can bring ideologically. It wants to focus on human reason, human power, divorced from religion, essentially. Okay, so that's a brief intro to humanism. Now, in terms of the art and the science and the development of the Renaissance period, that kind of goes hand in hand with humanism, as you can kind of just see from the artwork. If you look at humanistic artwork, or I'm sorry, Renaissance artwork, there is a big presence, or a very noticeable presence, of humanity in their artwork. There's less divinity, right? There's less God in some sense. It's more focused on less landscapes, if you want. It's more focused on how humans fit into that particular structure. So, a couple figures. In terms of art and technology, we have figures like Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, really pushing what it means to be a polymath, pretty amazingly. The man, not only was an obscenely good artist, but was also a really developed and accomplished architect, or like, what do you want to call it? Artificer, if you want to use that kind of more classic term. He was an artificer. Now, then in the world of the natural sciences, you have these figures like Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, all these sort of guys. And what is interesting about this particular period, and it's going to be important in the Enlightenment, is that you don't have this major conflict, or but you have the kind of the roots of it. You don't have this major conflict between religion and science yet, but you can see that there is going to be the political, fuel for it when you start to have this movement of Protestantism and humanism and secularism, and now we have this shift in sciences. There's going to be a lot of friction between the kind of more classic medieval sort of Catholic-minded people who, at least in political terms, want to maintain power, and then we have people who kind of want to begin to flex the possibilities of science and the possibilities of human reason as well. That is, again, a little bit of an oversimplification, but as I want to re-emphasize to you from what we learned in the religion units, these figures, and we learned this in the medieval one as well, these figures of Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, all these kind of guys, were all deeply religious people. Okay, they all believed very fervently in the existence of God and the truth of Christianity, and they did not see any incompatibility with their scientific beliefs and their religious beliefs. In fact, what most people who study this period will argue is that it is only because of their religious beliefs that they were able to make the scientific discoveries that they did, simply because they understood the natural world to be ordered and created in a logical sequence that God had structured. So therefore they could kind of try to follow it. They didn't see the world as a sacred, part of the divine, right? God is separate from the divine. So this is a creation of God that we can study. It's not something that we have to be afraid of kind of understanding and looking deeper into. And the incidents that I'm mentioning that you usually hear, like of how, Galileo is imprisoned by the Catholic Church and all this kind of stuff, that's when we have to get into that game of how do we analyze history, because incidents like that did happen. We did have members of the Catholic Church persecuting members of the scientific community. However, we also have members of the scientific community who were popes and who were leaders and members of the Catholic Church. So it's not that simple. It's not a simple dichotomy where we have, the evil, snarling Catholic Church kind of coming after these bright and bold, noble scientists. That's a deep oversimplification. That was more true just in that scene of Galileo's conflict. But if you want to look at it more broadly, it's more complex. It's more complex just like it is today. We have a ton of people who are deeply interested in the sciences, who are also deeply religious and find no incompatibility, versus you have some people that are strongly opposed to it and have a serious divide between those things. So careful for these religious, oversimplifications. Now, once again, we kind of throw Michelangelo in there as, a development or as a major figure in the development of art and architecture. So if we look down here, two of these works, rather, this one right here at the Sistine Chapel, we have Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel, and his more preferred version or form of art, which is sculpture in the form of the Pietà. Both of these pieces can be found in the Vatican to this day. So if you go to the Vatican City, or if you go to Rome, even to this day, you'll see the fruits of the Renaissance architecture, which is just like the medieval period, but even to a higher extent, just gorgeous and kind of mind-boggling in its complexity, that people several hundred years ago were able to spend an obscene amount of time and commitment and detail on these pieces of work. It's just insane feats of art. Now, before we get into that, one note about art, a little detail about artistic culture, which again is a little bit of an oversimplification, but is a cool metaphor, if you want, of the shifting cultures of the time that I've always clung on to, is this question of autographs, or this question of signing one's artwork. So if you generally look at medieval works, the majority of their visual arts are not going to contain many signatures that we would understand, many dates and signings of the artist. Well, why? It's because the art is for the art's sake. The artist is in some sense trying to practice a shift of focus away from them and more onto God and more onto the artwork, right? It's essentially like saying, I want you to just look at my art without me. I want you to let the art carry you where it's supposed to carry you. Versus in the Renaissance, and it's going to continue on further and further down the history of art, we have more of a presence of an artist wanting to say, no, this is me. This is my accomplishment. You should know it was I who made this, right? Look at what me, a man, has done, okay? So as you can see, that kind of shows us in some sense, even if it is a little bit anecdotal and more legendary, in its form, it does kind of characterize the shift from the medieval mindset to the more Renaissance and eventually the Enlightenment mindset. We are shifting away from the communal and deeply religious kind of mentality, and we're shifting more and more towards the secular, more and more divided in some sense, kind of away from the Catholic Church, if you want to like find a body or an organization to embody those things. Okay, so looking back real quick, a couple things we didn't do. We didn't talk about Christian denominations, and let's see, that's what we need to do now. So Christian denominations, really quickly. I've cheated a little bit here, and I'm sure my historian friends and my Christian friends will find this controversial, but that's okay. So I put here under Christian denominations this thing called apostolic or Nicene Christianity. Now, what does that mean? That means Christianity as it was practiced for the first 300 years or so of Christianity before the culmination of the Nicene Creed and the closing of the New Testament texts. So what did that Christianity actually look like? That's the point of why I put it there, because I love to open up that question. What did the original form of Christianity really look like? Were there bishops? Was there the Last Supper? Were we practicing the Last Supper, rituals? Were we doing all this kind of stuff? Well, that's essentially what all of these groups are arguing about. They're saying, well, wait a minute, which of us is being truly consistent with how Christianity was originally? The Roman Catholics are, of course, going to say, we are consistent. We are practicing all of the things that were handed down by the apostles and written down in the Nicene Creed. They're very adamant about that. They're like, look at everything we're doing, look at everything that we're, understanding. And to the Catholics' credit, if you go pick up a Catholic catechism, which on every Catholic school and every Catholic church, it is very, very detailed. It is very, very inclusive. They do not let one line of the New Testament go untouched in their analysis and their attempt to integrate it into their practices. So they're very thorough. And I always say this about Catholicism, in our religion discussions in class, you need to, for whether you hate it or love the church, you really do need to admire or at least respect in some regard the sophistication of thought that they have. They have a really systematic, kind of organized way of thinking. Their theology is very complex, okay? Now, the Eastern Orthodox, also have a very complex system of theology, and they will also say that they are closer to what Apostolic and Nicene Christianity would have been. They're very different than the Catholic Church, of course. They do not follow the hierarchy of the Pope and all this kind of stuff. They do have bishops. They do have that, but their bishops are usually elected, generally, and more the saints, rather, not less so than the bishops, are usually elected from the bottom up, right? The people usually kind of help elect the people in the church and the venerated saints therein. The major differences between the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox is that, yes, while the Roman Catholics follow the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Eastern Orthodox do not. The Eastern Orthodox, famously will believe in the presence of a divine figure in icons. So go look up iconography. They're very big on that. And the major distinction between these two groups and the Protestants is on the question of not just authority, but on the question of human salvation, or what is called in theology soteriology. How do we justify ourselves for salvation, essentially? The Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox say it is by both, to put it clichely, it is by both faith, it is by both our belief and our trust in God, as well as our works and our kind of, what do you want to call it? Yeah, works and faith. So it is this idea that we need to work and improve our nature and continue to become closer to God in our actions as well as in our faith and our belief. Now, the Protestants differ dramatically, where they say no, works are not required. It is simply I shouldn't say simply, but it is most essentially just your faith. Your faith is what will save you, essentially. Now, welcome to the great theological debates. Which one's correct? I'm not here to tell you. I'm just here to kind of show you what they're saying. Within the Protestant denominations, you also have a rejection, again, of the Catholic hierarchy. So we don't follow Rome. We don't follow the traditions of the Catholic Church. And from that point on is when the Protestants start to differ from one another pretty dramatically. So, for example, Lutheranism and Anglicanism do practice the Last Supper, do practice the communion ritual, whereas the Baptists do not. Whereas some of the Calvinists, it's all different for all these different denominations. So, like the whole question of the Eucharist, right? The whole the bread of Christ's body. Is this actually Christ present there, or is it not? Right? That's something where all the Protestants, differ on pretty dramatically. How do we worship? Who is our leaders? All this kind of stuff. How do we interpret the Bible? Is the Bible inerrant? All this kind of stuff. All of that, differs within the different Protestant denominations. Anglicanism is, again, kind of a weird offshoot of Protestantism, where they essentially just follow the teachings. I should say the teachings. They essentially follow the general practices and the general ideas of Roman Catholicism. but their whole structure of their hierarchy and their authority is different. They do not follow the Roman Catholic authority. They don't follow the Pope, right? They follow the Church of England, okay? And yeah, so that's a very just general, simplistic overview of the general Christian denomination. So if we move forward in history, and if you were talking about like, are we talking about the Catholics, or are we talking about the Protestants, you have some idea as to like, wait, these are the guys who do think this, don't think this, who align with this, don't align with this. But yeah, that's generally how we need to understand the different groups within Christianity. Okay, now that's pretty much it for just my brief general overview and discussion in our notes on the Renaissance. Next time, what we're going to talk about is the figure of William Shakespeare and a little bit of his writing, and the figure of John Milton and a little bit of his writing, as well as some commentary on where we are going in history and any patterns we can see in history at this point. But that essentially is all that I wanted to cover for the Renaissance. And hopefully you were able to follow along with the notes pretty simply, pretty straightforwardly. And I will see you in the next video. Have a fantastic day. Bye.